Okay, Steve, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invite. It's always nice to be on the other end now and then, although it's also nice to be the interviewer and just feel like, relax, let the other person just go. So it's good to be on the other end sometimes, though.
Yeah, I bet it's nice to kind of relax and just have the questions fired at you, I imagine.
It's surprising you realize how much you know when you get asked questions, because sometimes when you're, especially when you're a content producer, which I imagine like yourself, lots of the audience probably are as well, you struggle for content and ideas. So like the Instagram ask a question function is great because you're like, man, I can answer so many of these questions. Why didn't I can't think of content though, but when someone asks you a question, you're like, oh yeah, I can talk about this.
Yeah, I use a lot of those, as well as like email questions and things, just purely to create content.
Yeah.
And also, that idea of delivering value and stuff. So for those people that potentially don't know who you are, just could you give us a brief overview of what you do at the moment?
Cool, 100%. So I'm also a podcast provider, or Revive Stronger rather. So let me rename or re-say that. I am the founder of Revive Stronger, which is a content provider, mostly via podcasts. We have some articles on our website as well, but the podcast is revivestronger.com, revivestronger, not .com. The website is revivestronger.com. I feel like I need to restart this whole thing, but it's fine. People get the gist. Revive Stronger is the brand. I am the founder of that. I head that up with Pascal Floor, who is kind of also on the podcast. We do our own little segment on there as well. The podcast is very similar to this sort of format, interviewing experts within the field, very much based around physique competitors, maximizing muscle growth, fat loss, competitors from physique, bodybuilding, bikini, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also do online coaching. So again, not the majority of our clients are actually coaches themselves, and
Right.
we actually coach probably like a small amount are actual competitors. We want to expand that, but yeah, we have a lot of like somewhat general, but everyone's got a huge interest in kind of bodybuilding and maximal muscle growth, that sort of thing. So it's really cool. But that's the brand, and I am also a bodybuilder myself. So I've only competed 2 seasons, but done 6 shows. So yeah, there should be another one coming in the horizon as well. So I'm excited for that, because the natural bodybuilding scene in the UK, especially in the UK, but I think worldwide, is just getting ultra competitive to a level it's inspiring, but also kind of like, damn, I wish I'd found this a few years before, because I'd have stood more of a chance.
Yeah, well, I found that completely within the CrossFit space. I was like, if only I had a few more years to
Yeah.
continue training. But you've then always got those genetic freaks as well who train for like 2 years and are beating you, and you're like, this just isn't fair. It's just one of those things, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. And then you have to remember that like any endeavor like this, I suppose CrossFit actually is very similar in that it's very selfish. It's not a team sport, or at least the majority of it isn't. I think there are aspects that could be team, but I
Yeah,
don't know
there
it
are
too.
now. Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, it's quite a selfish endeavor. So it's all about you. And so I think drawing from the process and enjoying kind of the training, the nutrition, the life lessons you get along the way, that is super important. So yeah.
No, cool, nice one. Have you got a date in the diary for your next show then, or are you just kind of biding your time until you feel you're ready?
So I have planned backwards from a show in 2020. So it would be next year, that's what I'm thinking. But I'll be starting a diet in about 3 months. So the start of next year, I'll be starting a diet. See how lean I can kind of get within that. See how I'm looking. Kind of get the somewhat look like a bit of a bodybuilder in some ways, like have some muscle separation, but by no means shredded. If I'm in a good point, then I'll maintain and I'll dig into some shows. So I'll go through a lower volume phase, eat up to maintenance, reduce the diet fatigue, but maintain that lean physique, and then dig into some shows. But if I'm kind of like, nah, things do not look improved enough, or I don't know, life happens, doesn't it? If
Yeah.
something happens that's particularly stressful, or means competing shouldn't be on the cards, and I shouldn't make that selfish decision, then I won't. But yeah, if I can do August shows and qualify for finals, which are around this time actually, so September, then that would be really exciting.
Cool. I like that approach actually. You've kind of backdated it, but then you're also like, I'll see where I am at that time and then assess it, rather than kind of going through a show if things are up shit creek or something else has happened. So it's a pretty
Yeah,
good way to look at it.
I think Cliff Wilson, we had him over actually just recently. He came over to London for a seminar,
Mm,
and he's obviously one of the most experienced bodybuilding competitors and coaches, more so than anyone else. The amount of like people he's taken pro is just ridiculous, like
right.
hundreds of pro cards. It's just like, damn you, Cliff, that's impressive. And one of his main take homes was give yourself enough time, because so many people don't.
Mm,
So yeah, planning backwards, I think, is a really important thing. A lot of bodybuilders, like you said, they don't really think about it. They're just like, oh yeah, I'm pretty big, I'm kind of lean. Oh yeah, I can get shredded in 10 weeks. It's like,
mm.
oh no, it takes a long time to, you have a lot. People forget how much fat there is in between, like just between the ribs, between each muscle. Shredded glutes are like a standard now, not
Mm.
like freak. So yeah, it's something you definitely need to prepare for.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, for those people listening who aren't into bodybuilding but just are into that idea of getting leaner and then putting muscle on, and that kind of circuit, it's interesting how you said about people just don't give themselves enough time. And I think it's common with both fat loss and muscle gain that people kind of want to rush it, and then they also don't go through that cyclical nature of having breaks because they just want to get to that destination.
Yeah, I think I can't remember what the quote is exactly, but it's something along the lines of people overestimate what they can do in a short period of time and
Mm,
underestimate what they can do over a long period of time.
mm,
So it's kind of that, yeah, short termism that a lot of us are driven towards, rather than taking that kind of, I mean, bodybuilding, but bodybuilding is just growing muscle and losing fat. So you can apply that. Anyone listening who grows muscle and loses fat is somewhat of a bodybuilder. But
mhm.
that idea is it's a sport of like delayed gratification,
Yeah.
because the best bodybuilders are like really old because they've been doing it for so long. It's very rare to get like super impressive juniors who have only been like training for a couple of years. And when there are those, then they're genetic freaks, and you just like, right, you go away.
Yeah, they are the outliers, as you said. Yeah, I think that idea of delayed gratification is so key because of the world we live in, where we have so many podcasts, articles, YouTube videos, and everything else that we can get to at the click of a button. We kind of want our bodies to respond the same, whereas it's just not the case, and it's almost alien for us now to apply delayed gratification to anything because everything's been optimized for speed of delivery.
I think it's really scary, because that's why all these fat loss fad diets do so well, because people just see them and they're like, oh, this magazine says you can lose like 10 stone in 10 weeks or something. It's just like, and people know that that's ridiculous, and they know, like, if they just thought about themselves, it's just like, that's not something that is sustainable, surely. But so many, like, and the saying is, the diets don't fail, the people fail after the diet. You
Mm,
can lose the weight, they just can't keep that weight off. And this actually alludes to something that we're probably going to talk more in detail on, like muscle growth.
mm,
That's hugely delayed gratification. The sad thing is, at the start, it is quite quick, and you do
mm,
get your newbie gains. Like each week, you're getting much, much stronger, and you can see visible progress. But after that first year, everything slows down so much to a snail's pace. And I think that's why you get a lot of guys who kind of, they get into decent shape, but they never necessarily get into that like shape they really want.
mm,
They either just don't know enough, they aren't educated enough to think about further, or not consistent enough of applying the things they need to. And then, unfortunately, you see a lot of guys seeking out like steroids and these sort of things. And that's obviously becoming more prolific. There's always like an article coming out now and then about how much it's grown in the last years. And you're like,
mm.
whoa, I can't believe like that many people. Like, there's probably a silly percentage about the number of people in your like local gym that would be on, and you wouldn't even probably be able to tell, because some people don't respond that well, and some people don't have the other basics down to actually see the kind of growth they should from what they maybe are taking.
Yeah, yeah. You have that idea of again, like taking something like a steroid is similar to looking for that magic bullet supplement, isn't it? It's only going to enhance your gains if you've got your larger rocks in place first and they're doing all those basics. But people almost want to feel that they're more advanced than the basics because they've been told the basics, but they don't apply them. So they feel like they know them and need kind of more detailed information. And it's like, well, actually, if you got these right and did them, it's like this is 80 to 90% of your results, and the other stuff's just icing on the cake.
It's scary because whenever I even know this when I was less advanced than I am now as a trainee, but you look at like programs and it will say like for not like novice, beginners, intermediate, advanced, and you're like, I'm advanced, surely. Like advanced must mean that it's better. It must mean
Yeah.
that I grow quicker. And it's like, no, 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 no. It's for people who grow slower. It's like it's over the top for you as someone and you'll grow slower if you go for advanced methods before you've got all the others down. So yeah, I think I remember reading it in like, it might have been Jim Wendler's 531 or something along those lines, or like a Mark Ripito type of book by him, like Practical Programming, where it was like, assume you're a beginner. Just assume you're a beginner. If you're reading this, assume you're a beginner. If you find that doesn't do you anything or doesn't provide what you need, then go up.
Yeah.
People just assume they're advanced and then they're like hitting their head against a brick wall. It's that old looking in like Flex magazine and seeing all the pro Olympia competitors, their training, and it's like, that's completely inappropriate for, again, someone natural, but also someone who's been training like a couple of years versus someone who's been training like 20.
Yes.
It's just, people forget that's not how they got where they are. That's what they're doing now to improve.
Yeah, and that can imply to my demographic as well, is that idea of you probably don't need the training program that someone far better than you is doing. You need the one that where you're at now to then get you further there. And I guess it's a good place to start, really, because when we look at massing, we look at these guidelines of like surpluses and body weight recommendations, and based usually on kind of trainee status, because this idea of, as you said, after the first year, newbie gains slow down, and then after sort of 2 to 3 years, you then really are crawling along, and then you've got that idea of 5 years plus. It's at an absolute snail's pace. But how would you start to classify someone in a kind of trainee window? Would it be based on their progression with weights, or can you classify it as years trained?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one because there are strength standards. I think you can even probably Google strength standards and you can put in your numbers for various lifts, like your rep maxes, and it can tell you, it can try and tell you where you are in terms of strength standards, in terms of level of advancement. But I don't think that's always appropriate, because you can just think of maybe a skinny powerlifter who has very good leverages, who might look super advanced, but he hasn't done barely any volume training and hypertrophy training. If you put him on some, he may grow like a weed immediately, and so wouldn't need advanced stuff. And likewise, there's some huge guys who are weak and it's just like, again, could be leverages, could be muscle fiber types. So I don't think strength standards work really well. I kind of like years of consistent training. That tends to be best. I'd say years of consistent training and probably nutrition as well, because they kind of go hand in hand. Although I would say if someone's been training like, I don't know, 15 years and they've never put themselves in a surplus, I don't think they're going to be a newbie as soon as they put themselves in a surplus. They've probably just been really handicapping some growth there. So yeah, maybe I would say years of consistent training and probably combined with consistent eating is the best way to kind of differentiate between. If I was trying to think of like number of years, I might say 1 to 2 years. Within the first 1 to 2 years is kind of a newbie. 2 to maybe 7, 8 years is kind of intermediate. It's quite a wide range. And I would say like you could be like a new intermediate and then a later intermediate. And then like 8 to 10 years plus, that's when you're starting to become advanced. And anyone who's like 15 years plus is like super advanced and probably very close to their genetic limits.
Would you, a couple of things that you can then kind of segue from that would be probably age of the participant, and then also if they've been training and then had a year off, 2 years off, would you then backtrack them, or how would that kind of classification model work?
Yeah, I think in the real world that these sort of things are always going to happen. And what I would say is, I don't know, it's difficult because when you are growing as a like teen, you are kind of, your testosterone levels are the greatest and highest they're ever going to be, and they're in a really good position. And then obviously as you get older, these are going to potentially decline. And I think when you get, it might be like 40 years old or so is when that's potentially when kind of progress is quite unlikely, and maybe actually you might see regression. But I think if someone's training for the first time at 40, they're still going to grow. They're going to grow muscle because they just haven't even kind of started anything yet. They're
Mm-hmm.
just not going to grow as much as they potentially could have when they were younger. And I think probably a lot of it may come down to when you're older, just risk of injury is higher. Your joints and everything just aren't going to be as good as they would have been when you were younger, and your kind of ability to rebound after an injury probably isn't as great.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say is I'd not want people to really think about it too hard. I always think this for like genetics. When people are like, oh, am I a high responder or low responder? They like put themselves through these different models of like their genetic potential, how much muscle could they grow. And
Mm-hmm.
even when people, there's been studies like people who are told they have good genetics will grow better. People who are told they're bad genetics will grow worse. So just think you have good genetics, or just don't think about it. Do your best job and you'll get what you get. So the same
Yeah.
with if you're older or younger, just assume you're like in a really good position to grow, and you can grow really well, and you'll probably grow better than you could hope for. So yeah, I never like people to think about those things too hard, because it just doesn't help in any way, shape or form.
Yeah.
In terms of injury, it's been pretty well shown that muscle memory is like a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we have like myonuclear domains that once they're kind of made alive, probably the wrong terminology. People have to forgive me. I'm not a researcher, so I don't know these things like off the back of my hand. But once these kind of nuclei have been activated, you've had muscle there previously, it's very easy for them to become active again when they've become dormant. So you might lose some initial size. If you've been injured for a couple of years, you're going to lose it if you can't weight train. But once you get back into things, they're much likely to come kind of alive again, and you'll see that muscle growth come quite swiftly back,
Mm-hmm.
which is really cool. And we had a podcast with Alex. I've forgotten his last name. I think he was just called Alex. It was Calitera or something. I can't remember, but it's Alex K
Yeah.
essentially. And he talked about it in depth, and there's just really cool stuff about how it might have been like evolutionary needed in that in the kind of winter we'd hibernate, and so we kind of grow muscle in the summer as we're like hunting and everything, and then we'd
Mm-hmm.
hibernate, and then we kind of it would somewhat go, but as a mechanism, so we would be in a good position when we come back to hunt again, it would come quickly back. So
Sure.
yeah, it's something I wouldn't say again people should worry too much about. uh,
Mm.
the people who are consistent like 90-80+% of the time, that's the people who are going to do really well. It's unfortunate when you see the people who are like consistent in summer and then they take the whole of winter off and it's like 50-50. It's like, oh, you're doing well to just hold on to what you've got at the moment.
Mm. Yeah, it's that same thing, isn't it? It's that consistency of training, picking probably a starting point and probably underestimating where you are, and then taking it from there and analyzing results. But I guess, for people who are looking then to maximize muscle growth, you talked about needing a surplus, otherwise kind of you half it, halving your gains maybe, or missing out on gains is what you said. So why is it necessary to have that surplus for bulking? Like, is it not possible to really do it maintenance? And I guess where would you start with setting up an appropriate surplus and not just doing a dirty bulk, for want of a better phrase?
Yeah, it's I would say I'd importantly always tell people, because I certainly was under the impression years ago, and this was just through lack of real understanding and thinking things through well enough, that a surplus was required for growth. It was kind of like, without the raw materials there, how are we going to grow? If you're trying to build a foundation to your house, you can't build it out of the bricks you've got. You need to get new bricks to build that. And that's not completely false thinking. It's quite kind of rational thinking, but we can still grow muscle at maintenance. But the chances of doing that when we're more advanced become less and less likely. So
Sure.
anyone who is like more intermediate going on advanced, if they're just maintaining all the time and they're training hard, they could be growing very, very, very slowly. So slowly that they wouldn't even necessarily be able to detect it,
Yeah.
which could lead to wheel spinning, which is super frustrating. And I've certainly been there in the past, where I kind of got to a level of body composition that I was pretty happy with it. And I got to a level of food that I was like, this is a nice amount of food to be able to maintain on. And I would train hard, and I do that for months. I think I must have spent 6 months to a year doing that at one point, and I just didn't make noticeable improvements. And that's the really gutting thing, because you can put in so much hard work within the gym to not get that much of an outcome.
Mm.
Whereas if you just provide a small surplus that allows body weight to come up, And of course, you're going to gain fat, and that's the thing everyone hates. But it's
Hmm.
kind of the cost of doing business, of getting the best growth,
Yeah.
is some fat gain. You're going to grow so much more muscle, and you're going to potentiate that. And it isn't the case that, like you said, more food isn't better.
Hmm.
There is a kind of a steep curve where, yeah, more food is better, and then to a point it just is the same, like, and you barely get anything more, but you gain a bunch more fat.
Yeah.
And that is probably, for most people, gaining per month between 1 to 2% of additional body weight is probably a good place to be. I
Hmm.
know some people like to kind of scale that towards more novice, more kind of advanced, but I find that kind of 1 to 2% in practical terms suits most people. I find, or at least I found for myself, as I alluded to, when I was thinking I was more advanced, I probably wasn't as advanced as I thought I was, but I was like, oh, I can only gain like a pound of muscle a month. So I should aim to gain only a pound per month.
Hmm.
And that was when I maintained for months on end,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
because there'd be like 1 week I'd go up a pound. So I was like, oh, I better reduce my calories then. And then I'd be like, all right, I just lost 2 pounds. I better increase them. And then I'd be like, oh, I'm up again. And even when I didn't change my intake, and I just, like, by the end of the month, it just seemed like I was maintaining, and it was like hitting my head against a brick wall because I was just stressing too much about this pound. Whereas when I allowed that to be 1 to 2%, so that's for me like 2 to 4 pounds at the
Hmm.
moment, that just freed up so much mental capacity, because it was like, well, 2 pounds is an amount that I can actually see kind of happening over a course of weeks. And if I look over the long term, look every 2 weeks at kind of how things are moving, it
Hmm.
made sure I was gaining. And this is certainly the best gaining phase I've had. And I've worked with so many clients who have been similar to me in that they've kind of put themselves in that advanced box and been like, I'm just going to gain at the slowest rate ever, because they're fearing the fat gain, and they're thinking they can't grow at a certain pace. And once I opened up the reins to gain a bit more,
Hmm.
they enjoyed their training more because they got more food, more carbohydrates coming in, better recovery, better able to do more volume, increasing their ability to probably potentiate muscle growth as well. As we know, volume is so important for that, and then recovery from that.
Hmm.
And they just enjoyed life more. They became less stressed, and the growth just increased. Whereas in a year, they might have, like, I don't know, gained a little bit, mini cut, and kind of, they just, by the end of the year, they'd done a lot of like short gaining, short cutting, and they're kind of the same weight, same body composition, same strength. It's like, oh, this is so frustrating. And so
Mm.
when they went through a consistent long kind of gaining phase and really letting the weight just come up, letting themselves get kind of quote unquote soft, and but looking big in t-shirts and kind of feeling strong in the gym, and then going through a dieting phase, it was like, oh, now actually I can see that new muscle that's kind of been grown. So yeah, those are at least my perspectives on that.
Yeah, no, it's really good to hear from someone that obviously goes through it as well as then talking with clients with it. Because I guess you have that same idea of like when people start a diet and they have that initial loss of water weight and they see like, oh, this is working so well. You'd probably have the opposite effect with bulking. And especially if you're increasing carbohydrate, you have that idea of, oh crap, like I've put on 1 to 2 pounds in a week. It's actually just because you've upped your carbs and put on a bunch of water weight. And so then actually by halting early, you're, as you said, shooting yourself in the foot rather than waiting until the end of the month and then looking at your average weight increase across that month to then make more recommendations. Um, the thing I kind of wanted to segue into that, you were talking about this idea of, I spent this year kind of at maintenance and doing a lot of like hard yards, but not really seeing any growth. And so were you measuring growth then through your body weight and through like girth circumferences, or were you doing it through strength? Because is there like this idea that obviously you could probably grow strength in the gym without necessarily growing muscle mass, because, well, not muscle size, because hypertrophy and strength are different outcomes.
Yeah, it's quite this makes muscle growth even more frustrating, because with fat loss it happens so quickly. You can
Mm.
see it visually. It's like there's not even a question. You can see it visually, and measurements are pretty good because you can measure your waist and other circumferences, and kind of the waist should be kind of going down quicker than other circumference measurements. But
Hmm.
even just the visual, like you can see it in the mirror, and obviously the scale shows it as well. And then gym performance is kind of another indicator. And you can use these tools as well for muscle growth, but they're just less reliable,
Right.
because quite often, like you said, people hold on to more water from all the carbohydrates. Maybe they're a bit inflamed because they're doing like high volume training, and so they automatically look a bit softer. And depending on the person, some people are really lucky, and I probably put myself in this category, in that I hold body fat pretty evenly across my whole body, so nothing looks really lean, but nothing looks like really fat either. Whereas some guys, unfortunately, hold quite a lot on their stomach, and then their abs go straight away, and they're like, "Oh, my abs are gone, so I'm definitely put on a load of fat and like no muscle," and so they cut really quickly. So yeah, in terms of like how to assess muscle growth is occurring, like you said, strength gains can happen without muscle gains. It can be neurological. Strength is a skill to a certain extent. So in terms of performance, one, I think you can scale it in terms of which is the most predictable that you've gained muscle. So if you've improved, say, within the 5 to 30 repetition range, you've hit a new kind of PR with a certain lift, you can be pretty sure you've gained muscle. But you can be even more sure if you've hit like a PR in terms of number of sets. So maybe you're kind of 5 by 10 to 15. You've done 5 by 10 to 15, but with a higher weight or something like that for the entire kind of course of those sets. And then another way to look at performance is on movements that aren't skill based. So it might be like a leg extension, a leg curl, or like just a bicep curl, or like maybe a chest fly, something that just the skill component's so small that it's not really going to influence your performance on it. And if you've PR'd on that, again, across multiple sets, then you can be pretty sure you've gained muscle within that kind of hypertrophy, for lack of like hypertrophy rep range, for lack of a better kind of term for it, because obviously as long as you've got weight on the bar, you're in kind of a hypertrophy rep range. It's very, very wide, but 5 to 30 reps kind of is a good way to kind of look at that. So performance is one indicator. So, but like you said, if you've improved performance, you can't be still sure. So then if body weight's also gone up,
right,
with performance, that is another like tick in the box. And then obviously visually, again, another tick in the box. If you visually look like, yeah, I look like I've gained muscle, then that's another tick in the box. And then probably the final one that I practically use with clients is girth measurements. So if kind of you've grown everywhere, your waist is probably gone up as well. If it hasn't, well, amazing, but it's probably gone up as well. If it hasn't gone up like crazy amounts and everywhere else has gone up as well, then that's another tick in the box.
Yeah.
If you have the majority of your boxes ticked, I'd say you can be pretty sure you've gained muscle. If only 1 or 2 are ticked, I'd be a bit kind of curious on that. And probably the biggest kind of most predictive of muscle growth, the performance and the body weight, because I think images, everyone's their own worst enemy. And people hold body fat in different places. Circumference measurements, human error is huge on those. People can be really bad at measuring their own measurements. So that's another one. So I would say, yeah, body weight, if that's predictably gone up and you're performing better in the gym, they're probably 2 big ones for you.
Sure.
Fortunately, we can't all afford like DEXA scans. And then even that, if you don't go on the same DEXA scan under exactly the same conditions, that can throw off measurements as well. So I just would certainly not use like, I don't know, your weight scale that tells you how much muscle mass you're holding on to, or an Omron kind of body fat one, something like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned them because, BIA scales are all the rage, aren't they? With the improvement in like wearable technologies and things like that. Like everyone's just looking for that kind of hack to tell them what their HRV is to their sleep, to their muscle mass. And people don't realize that the amount of errors in those BIA scales are huge, as you said, to conditions across the week. So like, you step on it one day and it's like 15% body fat, and then the next day it's like 20% body fat. You're like, holy shit, how's that happened? I think people would lose their trust in it if they did it daily compared to weekly, which obviously most people will do.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing is, I'm not even sure they're consistently inaccurate.
No.
I think they're just completely haphazard and just do not help you in any way, shape, or form. So if I have clients who have those and they kind of report to me their body fat, I'm just like really take it with a large pinch of salt if you're going to look at that number.
Yeah, I'm kind of just like, oh, cool. Right. And let's not worry about that though. Hey, it's one of those things. But no, I think that's a good answer because there will be people out there that are like, I'm actually not that bothered about getting that much bigger. I just want to get a ton stronger.
Cool.
And that's one of those things where, as you said, it's more of a it's a skill-based adaptation as well as you need to do enough volume to get that result, and actually being at maintenance or a slight surplus is going to be best. Because I guess you've got to take this on an individual level as well. If you've got someone who is a high NEAT responder and you've put them in a small surplus, if they then just fidget their way out of it, you're like, holy cack, have you found that quite a lot with people who are like hard gainers, and what would your approach for them be?
Yeah, it is important. I mean, I said this the other day on my Instagram, actually. I said that kind of actually massing is harder than cutting
Mm,
because you still have to take care of virtually all the same things, but over such a longer period of time.
mm,
And because you're not hungry or like anything like that, there's no like rush and you're not kind of stressed about anything. So you're like, if I don't like do this week, it's not such a big deal. It's like, no, but it is because you, like you said, you could set a surplus that would have been a surplus for that first week, maybe
mm,
predicted off your current maintenance. But after a month, that could now be a new maintenance because
yeah.
you might be one of those people, like you said, who just they end up doing, they recover from way more volume, they do more volume in the gym, they go for extra walks, they start tapping their leg, especially as people start getting towards kind of the upper end of where they're used to being in terms of body weight. I
Mm,
found for myself, now I pushed, the highest I'd ever weighed was 190 pounds, and I've pushed now to 200. For me to get through 200 is like harder than, it's almost as hard as like getting to 5% body fat. It's
yeah, yeah,
kind of a huge battle for me, and my calories just start, like I'm worried how high the calories are going to have to be pushed for me to kind of get past that point where I'm just, like I said, I'm hot all the time, hence sitting here in a vest like tapping my foot. I've got so much energy just to give to various tasks. It's just ridiculous.
yeah, yeah.
And so yeah, there's certainly, I've had clients who I've had to constrain step counts.
Right.
So I just see their steps, they're like at 10 and then they're creeping up to like 15. I'm like, can we get back to 10, please? Because this is just no good for us. Or
Mm,
try and get them to commute to work differently, whether or not they were like walking. I'm like, can you just maybe drive sometimes? These sort of things, because it gets difficult to chase sometimes. But
yeah.
like you said, the important thing is that you're weighing in consistently. So I like people to weigh in at least 4 times a week,
Right.
under similar conditions,
Mm,
and then take an average for the week and then compare that to weeks to see how they're trending. I like to look at every 2 weeks when we're gaining,
mm,
because it's a slow process. So if after 2 weeks they look like they're not trending and they're not keeping up to the rate of gain that we've targeted, then I would increase calories. So it'll probably just be 100-calorie increase at first, because if you've caught it after 2 weeks, it's not like they've suddenly kind of burnt through like, and they're maintaining on a
no,
way more. So
no, no.
and to just creep that up by another 100 calories, and we'll keep doing that. So yeah, there could be people, especially if someone's just kind of ended a long dieting period, they're probably adapt quite quickly to a surplus.
Mm,
There does normally become a time for people where you put them in a surplus and then that holds them for months upon months, but that's kind of when they've got through all that kind of maybe leaner point, and they're maybe a slightly on the less leaner side now as the body's a bit more comfortable.
yeah. And you'll also just get those individual responses to surpluses, won't you? Which is just one of those annoying things that people have to kind of deal with as and when they come. You have to treat themselves as individuals. And with that, we talked a little bit about training in the gym and talked a little bit about that volume that you need. How do you know? I guess you could basically say again to people, choose a starting point, see when you stop progressing, and then change things up from there. But is there a certain volume of reps that, volume of work per muscle group they need to be doing if they have like weaker body parts? How would you program that for people?
Cool. So something I really like, and I've been using for the last like 4 or 5 years, I think now, are the volume landmarks by Mike Israetel.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of talked about how you have a minimum effective volume. So this is the least volume you need to see kind of a efficacious growth response. Then we have our MRV, so max recoverable volume. So this is the most volume we can do and recover from. So if you were able to just repeat performance on the week, you'd hit that point. And if you tried to go again, you'd probably see detriments in performance. And then anywhere between this minimum and maximum is your max adaptive volume. So this is the most volume you can do and improve from.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where you're probably growing the quickest. So essentially, we want to spend most of our time in the middle at MAV. And eventually we're going to hit our max recoverable volume and we need to kind of deload and recover, take a period of time to allow fatigue to come down. And a good starting point is that minimum effective volume, I find, because it's kind of like easy gains in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it sets the starting point. So you don't, I don't know, arbitrarily start like a lot higher than you need to. If you know this is kind of the starting point of the race, you've got as much of a window as you can between that and then your max recoverable volume. You have the longest period of time where you're growing at the best rate.
Sure.
So yeah, it's very individual, and actually depends on so many factors that I don't think people really realize, in that not only are your training level, so how advanced you are, how strong you are, but also your environment. So are you training 6 days a week or 4 days a week? Are you doing like a really stressful job, or if you've got a really chilled out job that allows you to train twice a day maybe, or something like that, where you can spread your volume out?
Mm.
And then nutrition, are you really on top of that, or are you a bit lackadaisical about that? Training, are you in diet phase? Are you in a surplus, or are you in a deficit? What's happening there? So there's so many different variables that play into it. And it's just about, the reason I like it is because it's autoregulatory.
Mm-hmm.
So it individualizes by kind of identifying how are you doing in the gym, how are you performing, how you're recovering, and then you manipulate things from there.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of a starting point, if I had someone apply, and this happens quite regularly, surprisingly, actually, where people just don't know really how much they're doing in the gym, and they haven't really been following a strict program. They've just been going in and kind of winging it.
Yeah.
This happens. Yeah. I think,
Yeah, it's be most people. Be most people.
yeah. Even when they're coaches themselves, quite often they take care of all their clients, but then themselves, they're like, oh no, I just don't have the time for me. I'll just go in and train hard. So
Yeah.
this can happen. And when this does happen, I basically start off with what we know from science. And I find science is kind of like the starting point. It gives us an idea of where they should land, because we've got some data that provides averages, and they're more than likely average.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're kind of off average, we'll soon find out. So I tend to find, I tend to start people out in their first week for 8 to 10 sets per muscle group for the
Mm-hmm.
week. Lower for legs, particularly hamstrings, that might even be at like 6 sets, because they get wrecked very quickly. Whereas, yeah, for upper body, like chest and particularly back, that tends to be a bit higher for most people. So I start their week like that. And then I look at how they responded in that first week.
Sure.
How are they recovering? How have they felt in the gym? Have the workouts felt difficult? Have they been getting kind of any pumps? Have they been getting any kind of soreness following days? And if they've been getting kind of like middle ground on all of those markers, I can be pretty sure we found a good spot for them to start.
Mm-hmm.
And then over the following weeks, we're progressively overload.
Yeah.
I did an Instagram post and called it like auto-regulated progression model.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I will start with, in that first week, we're starting at 3 to 4 reps in reserve as well. So we could have done 3 to 4 more reps if we were to go to failure, but we've left some in the tank to allow us to progress in future weeks.
Cool.
And we found anything less than 5 reps in reserve is close enough to failure to provide a kind of efficacious intensity for a growth response.
Mm-hmm.
So we start there, and then every week I say kind of, can you add a little bit of load? If you can add a little bit of load, match reps from last week, brilliant, do that. If you can't add load, can we add a repetition?
Mm-hmm.
Normally you can add a repetition if you can't add load. And then once you've done that, can we add a set? Are you recovering from last week? Is your performance holding? You're not going into session sore or fatigued, and you're performing well? If you can, and you've got the time for it as well, because that can become a limiting factor for people, add a set. And that's kind of how I roughly work people through the weeks. So for like big compound lifts, they can normally add kind of 0.25 or 2.5 overall, and they can add that each week, and reps in reserve drop down. But for like, I don't know, dumbbell lateral raise, they might be on the same kind of like 12 kilos for the entire mesocycle, and they just add reps every week.
Sure.
Hit where they can, it allows for the person, and where they're responding well, I'll add sets as well.
Yeah, as you said, it's a time allowance thing, isn't it? Because you could play around with finding your max recoverable volume, but after a while, your session is taking like 2.5 hours because you're doing so many sets.
Yeah, that's where either you'd need to increase your frequency or start specializing, like you mentioned. Those sort of things come into it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's because it's one of those things where, as you said, these things are just starting points, and then you have to assess and progress. And this is where having a coach can really help.
Yeah.
Or actually having a plan and having a training journal. Because I was talking to Greg Knuckles about it in terms of strength training, and he was saying, your recovery on your legs may be higher than on your upper body, and it may be the other way around. You might recover from bench slower than you do from lat pull downs, and you just don't know it until you start actually taking record of these things. And as you said, recording RP per session, reps in reserve. Okay, can I add can I add weight? Can I add a set? Oh, crap, that crushed me. Take it back. It's kind of that test and measure, isn't it? You've just got constantly be a student of your own body.
Yeah, it's the key I found to being able to actually navigate a mesocycle rather
Yeah.
than just having, like, I don't know, for me it's similar to if you had a map and you didn't have anything on the map but this one road and one path to your destination, and then
Hmm.
that road becomes blocked and you're just like, right, what am I going to do? I'm just going to have to wait until the road is not blocked. But if you have the entire map and you understand things, you can be like, right, I can take this turning here and come round. That's what I find is the key for like auto-regulation through a mesocycle. It allows you to actually find a path for progression rather than just being like, I have to follow this plan.
Hmm.
That works for novices and maybe early intermediates. But once you get past that point, things get a bit more complex. You have to understand your body a bit better and play to it. And I find that kind of auto-regulated method, seeking different paths of progression, understanding your recovery capabilities, yeah, it's so important. And then you realize like, oh crap, sleep's really important. I don't
Hmm.
train well when I have poor sleep. And it makes you take care of all these things. It's like, oh, when I do all of that, I get great results. Whereas when you don't have an understanding of any of that, that's where you really start like, oof, it just doesn't go well.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Like people just they want to hack past these lifestyle factors, as we were talking about earlier. Like they don't care about sleep and stress. It's like, oh, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to go and lift heavy shit and train really hard. You're like, well, actually, these things kind of, we all have one bucket for stress, and these all add in, and this will affect your progression. And people just, yeah, they need to take care of those things as well.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunately that's like the old bodybuilding mentality. It's like
Mm.
harder is better. If I'm not doing well, I know I have to just work harder, and I can go closer to like I can work harder with failure. I can fail harder, and it's just like
Yeah,
after a while,
no
this
pain,
just
no
doesn't.
gain.
Yeah,
Like,
it just
let's just put us in
doesn't
the
work.
cave. No, and that's the thing, isn't it? It's like I talked about it on um a podcast of like how much we should train during like fat loss phases, and this idea of like more is not always better, and if you're actually overtraining and under recovering and putting your body under more stress, you could actually just put yourself in a position where you could potentially, I guess, lose muscle mass rather than fat, and your body will hold on to fat in that kind of almost desperation.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I have had people who have been at the extreme. I've had people who have been doing low volume and high intensity training, so
Mm-hmm.
like failure all the time, and they're getting injured and not seeing the results they want. But I've also had people on the other end of the spectrum who are, their volumes are just like crazy, and you're like, that's not sustainable. They're doing so much like junk volume and getting so fatigued, and they're tracking regression and not progression. And like
Right.
you said, if they're in a diet context, that's well, even in a, I don't know, maintenance or surplus, if they're
Mm.
just pushing themselves that much with volume, they could see losses in muscle. It's yeah, that's a horrible position to be in when you're working that hard and it's actually you're working against yourself.
Yeah, and that's where diet and training, as you said, come so hand in hand. And I think that's a couple of questions I had was one, this idea of like cyclical dieting phases, and that idea of like, okay, well, if you want to push a bulk on, how long do you do it to mitigate fat? And then yeah, I mean, we could talk about, because this episode is all about muscle building. We'll focus there, and we'll have another one about training while dieting and whether you sort of reduce volume. But I guess for now, like, yeah, how long should people bulk for, and then how do they know they've taken it far enough and need to kind of, as you said, mini cut or actually do a cutting phase?
Cool. So I used to, and this didn't help me and it didn't provide very good gains, is I would be that person who would basically bulk for as long as I could until I thought I was a little bit fat. And this could be like a year because I would be aiming for that really slow rate of growth of like gain on the scale. So
Mm-hmm.
half the year I could be maintaining, and half the year I was gaining, and like over the year I maybe had gained like 5 pounds, and I was like, oh, I better cut then. And that was just wildly inefficient. And like I said,
Right.
I barely saw any progress that way. Whereas now I like to be much more methodical, periodized, and congruent with my nutrition. In that, I will kind of, with my phase of nutrition, I'll phase that with my training. So I like to do kind of a surplus or deficit with hypertrophy. And then I will use periods of maintenance with a low volume phase, which we call a primer phase,
Mm-hmm.
to help recover essentially from all the high volume that you've been doing or all the dieting you've been doing with the maintenance. So I find that I don't like to go less than like 10 weeks or two mesocycles for massing. I think if you go like a mini mass for like a mesocycle. You just, like we said, muscle growth just takes so long. You're just really not going to be doing anything much apart from kind of storing a load of glycogen and then losing all of that coming off of it.
Yeah.
Minimum for sure of 10 weeks.
Cool.
And then I generally go up to 20 weeks. So that might be 3 to 4 mesocycles of massing in which you're gaining 1 to 2% of body weight over that period of time. So if you are being assertive about it and you're making the most out of that training phase, you should be significantly heavier by the end of that process. At the end of that process, I either go two ways. It's either a mini cut or a low volume primer phase. If they're at the end of where their body fat is appreciable and they're someone who's experienced with dieting, their lifestyle allows for it, we could do a mini cut. Mini cuts can be really, I think a lot of people think they're amazing, but they can be really annoying and they can really throw a spanner in the works. What we have to do is make sure we're not disrupting momentum of the mass too much, because that's a real thing in that the ball starts rolling and the machinery of massing just goes better and better. You get more efficient. But by the end of that, and the reason we're going through either a mini cut or a primer phase is because the volume of training has got so high that we're becoming a little bit desensitized to that. And obviously body fat levels could be at a point where we don't really want to get any fatter, whether or not that affects P ratios. So whether or not we're partitioning muscle, nutrients to muscle as well as we should do, that's not necessarily completely like convincing, but we're certainly maybe at a point where if we were to just continue massing, we just have to be in a massive cut for ages, which would be inefficient. So that's where a mini cut can come in. And the reason it helps also reduce body fat levels, obviously we're cutting, but also because we're doing it for such a short period of time, we can reduce volume quite a bit. So we just stick at our minimum effective volume, which is for the mini cut, essentially maintenance volume, because when we're in a deficit, we need more volume to kind of maintain the muscle because of the fact that we don't have the kind of anabolic from the surplus. Now we're in a deficit, muscle protein breakdown's a bit higher. So to improve our muscle protein synthetic response, we train maybe a little bit more to help maintain that. So that might be anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. So it's really short, losing it on average 1% of body weight per week. So you could get right down and fairly lean again, and then straight back into massing. And essentially it potentiates massing to set you up for another maybe 10 weeks of massing, or go through a primer phase, which is just a really low volume phase. So this is maintenance volume at maintenance intake. So it's really nice and low, much lower than what you've been doing the past weeks. That really allows for resensitization of pathways for hypertrophy. It really reduces injury risk, and it just gives you a full break. So if you're quite lean at that stage, maybe you're post-show or post a long diet and you've done 20 weeks of massing and you gained at 1% per month, so you're pretty lean at this point, you could just do a primer phase for around 3 weeks and then get straight back into massing for, again, another 10 to 20 weeks. And you can keep going through this kind of cyclical process. And what I would say is after 2 mini cuts, don't do any more, because you're either not really massing and then mini cutting properly. You're kind of like maintaining, because you should be getting a bit fatter every time you mini cut.
If you're doing it right.
Unfortunately, a lot of people end up trying to just mass and mini cut forever. The other problem with that, apart from being inefficient, if people try and like just circumvent all the fat they're gaining when they're massing, is that they're not truly getting a resensitization to training fatigue. A mini cut in itself is still fatiguing. So you're still getting a build up of that residual fatigue. So your actual ability to grow muscle is going to be reducing over that period of time. So you really want to, after 2 mini cuts, drop in a primer phase or a low volume phase where you really maintain, you allow things to really drop fatigue wise before you go again.
Yeah, that primer phase, you can always almost attenuate it to a bit of a deload, I guess, as you said. Like it's because it'll be a deload compared to massing, because you've had all this ton of volume and food, and actually just going back to maintenance intake and maintenance minimum effective volume. And it's kind of that longer deload style, just as you said, to drop that fatigue and prime yourself to go again, really.
I was just going to say, I
Go
try and
on.
avoid calling it a longer deload because although that makes complete sense, like in terms of macro cycle, it's like the deload of the macro cycle,
Yeah.
but people hate deloading.
Yeah, they do.
So when you say a prolonged deload, they're like, no way, this is not happening.
It's a good change of term, actually. Let's cut that from the podcast and just convince everyone it's a primer phase.
So
No.
I primer phase or like a strength phase, so they can focus on intensity in that period of time and
Mm,
strength progressions, maybe hitting some PRs, get a bit like into some powerlifting, maybe that kind of helps them get a bit more convinced. But once people have done it, they're like, yeah, I'm sold. This has helped me feel so much better in the gym.
yeah. And I guess that would be a good way to, because as you were saying there, do sort of 10 to 20 weeks of massing, maybe do a primer phase or a mini cut, go again, but don't do any sort of more than 2 mini cuts in your respective mass cycle. Would there be a place where you'd say you could do your second mini cut and get quite lean and you're quite big, and then just be like, actually, I'm pretty happy here. I'm just going to maintain for a good while longer before then deciding if you needed to do anything else, or you just reached your optimal size and you're like, great, I'm just going to maintain this for the rest of my life.
People could certainly do that.
Yeah.
I think most, at least the people I work with and myself, it's kind of a case of,
Let's always get bigger.
yeah, need more, more mass, please.
Yeah, yeah. I guess so. So for those listening, it's that kind of thing of like get yourself to a place where you're either happy and kind of go from there. But I guess that's human nature as well, though, isn't it? Is that we always want more. We either want to be bigger or we want to be leaner.
Yeah.
But I think, as you said there, it's actually really clear. It's really important to give yourself enough time to achieve that goal rather than getting scared halfway through and then doing a mini cut too early or for too long. Because then, as you said, you just end up spinning your wheels and knocking your head against the wall.
This is why whether or not that periodization approach is the best or optimal,
Mm-hmm.
certainly very effective because it gives people an idea of where they're going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the past, like I said, I would gain very, very slowly and just do somewhat like hypertrophy training for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of, I never felt as driven as I do when I know I've got right 20 weeks to mass. There's a
Yeah.
deadline. It's like, right, I'm going to be on it for these 20 weeks. So I know I need to be, and then I'm going to go through whatever it might be next.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a plan laid out in front of you, it's so much easier to execute when rather than just having, just some guidelines of like train somewhat hard and eat somewhat of a surplus, because then you just get a bit like lazy and you're not as motivated or driven.
Yeah, it's the same with dieting. People, if you don't, you kind of need to say, right, this is a temporary place of being. Like, ideally, you want to get to a place where you're happy and you maintain. And unless you are a bodybuilder, as you said, and you'll go through these cycles, and that's just your life because you're looking for the best condition possible. But for those out there who are just looking to look great, it's a case of you don't want to be dieting all the time. That's not what life is, and you don't want to be massing all the time. It's that idea of you need to set yourself a time period. Right, I'm going to diet for 8 weeks, and you're going to stick to it, and you can make it flexible and you can do whatever, but it's like, right, I'm only going to do it for 8 weeks. I've got to get the best results possible, rather than this kind of like, oh, I've messed it up again, like let's start again Monday type thing that people sort of find themselves in constantly.
You can apply that to so many areas of life, because I can even think to this morning, I just said to my girlfriend, I was like, oh, I forgot I had a podcast today. And I was like, I was being a bit like slow with my check-ins. I was like, because I was thinking I could be relaxed and I could be a bit late from the gym. And I was like, damn, I need to actually step up my game and get on it.
Yeah.
So it's the same sort of thing. When you've got things booked in, when you know you have deadlines, people are just so much better at executing. So yeah, it's been so helpful having a periodized model like that.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. I'm conscious of your time, so this will be the last thing we'll talk about today, and it would just be that idea of when people are bulking. Then, I mean, we probably already kind of covered it with what we've said. This whole idea of trying to stay lean is fresh in people's minds. What's your idea on steady state cardio and things like that while people are bulking?
Cool. So I think, unfortunately, people think that when they're doing the cardio, they're burning fat, and therefore they're kind of in a surplus, and then they're burning the fat that they're maybe gaining through the surplus via the cardio. That's wishful thinking, and unfortunately, it's not how the body works. Unfortunately, if you're in a surplus, you're gaining fat. It's just a consequence of being in a surplus. So all the cardio is doing is moderating how much of a surplus you're in. So you could either eat a bit more and do a bit of cardio, or just eat a bit less. That's all it's doing for you. it's not going to attenuate fat gain apart from helping moderate that surplus. The only other thing it could be good for is if people are quite sedentary. So if they're quite sedentary, they're not doing many steps, then it can help again moderate that surplus and maybe help a little bit of general fitness. But unfortunately, yeah, people can stop doing all the lists if they hit or the low intensity steady state cardio and just moderate how much they're eating a bit. And unfortunately, the cost of doing business is some fat gain when you're massing.
Yeah, as we've said, yeah. And actually, for people that struggle with appetite and eating as much, it's like actually, yeah, as you said, step count restriction and take out your lists, and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Well, cool. So Steve, obviously, you've mentioned the website and the podcast and everything like that. So I'll link up in those in the show notes. Is there anywhere else that people can go to find you?
So yeah, for me personally, the place I'm most active is probably my Instagram account, which is just Revive Stronger. If people want to DM me, they can feel free to. Like I said, I quite often chuck up questions, and I try and answer as many of those as I can. That'd be fantastic. And the website has everything on it as well. So the only other thing I think would probably be good to mention is Revive Stronger, the group on Facebook. We have like a free open group. I think we have 4,000 people in there or something, which is really cool. And there's always some great discussions in there. Normally something funny every week as well, where you're just like palm in face. So that's always fun. And yeah, if people are interested in the primer phase or anything like that, we have an ebook people can pick up, which is on the website as well. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a really awesome chat.
No worries. Yeah, thanks so much for giving up your time. It's been great.